We now have a question and answer opportunity with our first two speakers. So I'd like to invite Gabriel back. Now, if you pop your hand up, I will run to you with a microphone so everyone can hear what your question is.
Sorry, just about the figures before you mentioned those cases for child laborers. During what period of time was that, and during how many audits?
Okay, so I think it was the first slide where we asked them how many cases. Yeah, so we asked them in the last 2 years. And so we did the survey last beginning of, I think it was, beginning March, April of 2016. So when we say the last 2 years, that would be 2014-15. So we gave them this 2-year window. Obviously, we didn't double check if they were thinking of a case that was a bit earlier. But the question was, in the last 2 years, how many cases of suspected child labor did you encounter? And then the other one, how many of those cases were confirmed? So that's the question the data was based on.
Actually, just to follow up, so you asked, you mentioned 500 auditors, you interviewed 500 auditors. So if we take, for example, 2.8 suspected cases in China times 500, that's close to 1,500 suspected child labor cases in China. Is that correct? Across 2 years?
Yeah, if you do the math like that, it's definitely correct. So that's why I said I was really surprised with this number. Now, as I said, we work with companies and around these issues, and we do have a service for companies to help them remediate child labor cases. So companies call us when they found a child labor case. And we don't have that with hundreds of companies, but we do see that companies who kind of start to change their policies and really have a remediation in place, in the first year their cases increase, because I think their auditors and staff becoming more aware of it and also more ready to call it in. So we do have quite a few companies who would call us for 6-7 cases a year, which is kind of, I think, an average number that we get amongst the companies. So which is really, to be very frank, when I started this job like 2.5 years ago, I really thought child labor is not going to be the key focus of what we're going to do. And it's still not the only focus, but it's just popping up more than what I was expecting it would.
Hello, you mentioned about the compliance risk and reputational risk for the child labor. I think everyone agrees that child labor should be zero tolerance issues. And when I try to find some supporting about what is the financial risk actually child labor will bring to our organization, I found that it is quite limited data or information that we can find that's showing using child labor is actually hurting financially the organization. For example, H&M, Nike, or some toy factory like Mattel, Disneyland, they were always being reported have the child labor issue, but their profits seem still very good. So do you have any data or information or insight to share about this?
Obviously, it doesn't always work one-to-one, right? And so as you're saying, for example, you put the example of H&M. They actually, if you look at, unfortunately it doesn't work in the whole world, but if you look at the Swedish market for H&M, it will be impacted. Every time they have a story, the latest story they had about Myanmar, which might not have been totally fair or accurate, but every time they have negative stories, it does impact their performance in Sweden, for example. So there's a clear link there with consumers. Also, there's a stronger and stronger link, not necessarily just with consumers, but with investors. We were recently working with a company in the paper industry, and one of the reasons this company came to us is because after accusations of child labor came out in their market, their investors pulled out. And it just was a huge thing. It reshuffled basically the whole top of the company was replaced, and they had to kind of restart. They lost considerable, very important investors into their company. So I think sometimes you can really clearly see that. Even if you can't, what I see is that child labor always brings, that there's often a knee-jerk reaction because everybody gets so nervous about that. Suddenly compliance staff who's been not important gets a call from the CEO who's barking over the phone and says, what is happening? So I do think there is obviously a big risk, but I agree with you. Some companies get away with it quite well. But also those companies, it's not necessarily that they don't do anything, right? Many of them do react in some way or another and seem to manage to reassure consumers and investors that they are dealing with the issue until it comes up again. But yeah, we sometimes wish the correlation would be a little bit easier. But I think there was I think your data about the connection between quality and compliance. And I think, to be honest, if you have a factory like the factories I've seen, obviously there's no quality, there's very little efficiency. So I think maybe this monetary incentive comes not only from consumer behavior or income, but it comes really from your efficiency rating and from your quality ratings. And I think that's really what we see as well.
Thank you. I got two questions, actually. Number one is to Gabriel, and the other one's back to you, Ines. Maybe I should address the question to you first. I'm quite happy to hear that you have, in the child labor, moving into prevention through greater youth support. So I think child labor is actually a very murky term in many ways, in some way, because circumstances change between Pakistan and China and everywhere. Mm-hmm. By doing so, you're actually allowing a group of children, like you mentioned earlier, the dropped out one, be able to be gainfully useful in some way. How prevalent that effort is going to be now among all the different corporations, all these certifier like you guys work with? How is it being driven? Can it be driven to a bit more, how should I say, a more general practice? Mm-hmm. Can you tell me that?
Well, to be very honest with you, I think if you would ask me, it's our hardest sell. So if we go and talk to companies about child-friendly spaces, we're getting a lot of response. We're getting a lot of companies getting engaged. Migrant parent support, it's a lot of engagement. Child labor remediation, we see a lot of engagement. To getting companies to think differently about youth employment is a very tricky one. Many companies have really either explicitly or implicitly made it their policy to encourage suppliers not to hire juvenile workers or workers under 18 in order as a kind of like sure thing to avoid child labor. And so to change that, and we've seen it, so that's why I just made this example about Myanmar, where H&M had a negative press for having children that are of the age of 14 in their factories, which is actually legally and by ILO standards okay, as long as you respect the working hours limitations that the children have. So I think there's definitely work to do both in how NGOs talk about this and how we look at this, so that that companies get the and then there needs a couple of companies, and I do think, for example, IKEA right now is probably a pioneer a little bit in that effort. They have this for 2017 to really strengthen their youth employment and to do that in very protected environments, so that companies now have to, at the beginning of the year, tell IKEA which are the positions that would be suitable for juvenile workers. They have to be labeled, and they have to make active commitments to hire juvenile workers. So in Vietnam, for example, we're linking those up to community centers, where community centers then can reach out to unemployed youth or children out of school to get that into the factory. We're really working towards hoping to make this a stronger industry initiative. I think there's still a bit of work to be done, and we see sometimes that people on the ground are very supportive of this idea, but in the boardrooms of companies, this still instills a lot of fears, where kind of like staying away from it seems to be the easier option.
Thank you. The second question is actually back to Gabriel. I mean, I actually, in this survey, one of the comments I have is fatigue. The auditing fatigue is quite common. One of the frustration I have is really with the different standards of auditing by various agencies. Two questions there split up. Number one, is the certification of the auditors. Are they trained to be that in a certain standard? Number one. Second issue is, are you going to be working towards any possibility of a global standard? Everyone is different. Elevate is different. SGV is different. Everyone's different. The simplest one, the placing of a fire exit light, could change from one person to the next person. Now, these are standards that I think should be quite normal, but yet that could drive them to come back month after month after month of evaluation, and that brings in the costing there too. So I'm just curious, is there going to be a drive towards like Higgs Index, for example, to be a global standard that people know what's going on, and then everyone works towards that standard, and then you don't have to go through 16 different times of evaluation per year?
Yeah, so about the global standards, so two questions. One was about the different auditors and the way to be trained and so on. So there is different things. There is different standards. We can say too many. There is a lot of initiative now ongoing to standardize and to try to have a common approach. If we talk, there is a lot of different standards. I guess you get used to audit, to have recognition also about different audits which could be recognized between each other to avoid having to repeat these audits. In terms of the way it's audited, there is a lot of convergence in order to make sure that we stick to the standard. The auditor does not really have the choice also to audit. He has to audit according to which standard has been selected, usually by our clients. And so that's the difficulty, is that we don't always have this flexibility on our side, if we talk about our auditors, to take the decision by ourselves, because we have to follow the standards. What is existing, for example, is the APSCA, which has been created recently, which is the Association for Professional Social Compliance Auditors. So it's one of the initiatives, for example, which is grouping together brands, third parties, and any stakeholders to try to define a standard level of qualifications of auditors and a kind of certification as social auditor for all the industry. It's starting, it's on the way. Might take a few months to be ready, and there is so many information ongoing. I think also my colleague in the next session, Cornelia, is going to discuss also about these initiatives and all the general initiatives which are now being developed. So she will have also some information in the next presentation.
So to Gabriel. Sample size of ethical audits, so we saw percentages, but what was the absolute number across maybe several countries? Or if you could give a global number. Second, unrelated question, actually back to his question, which is audit fatigue. So for AI, do you see yourself doing sort of a AI alignment, sort of when a client asks you, okay, can you audit this company based on SA8000? But this company had done a SMETA 2 or SMETA 4 maybe 2 months ago. Would you tell the client, hey, this guy already done SMETA 2, can you use that SMETA 2? Or would you sort of just, okay, let's just do another SA8000?
So for the first question was about the sampling size, right? For the data, right? That we've been given. So this was on 1 year for 2016 mostly, and we are talking about. I don't have the exact number, but it's a few thousands of audits, so between around 10,000 of audits, which would be included in the data. About the way we work with our clients, we always try to discuss and to define the best program. That's the objective also when we start working with our clients, to identify what they want to do, to try to identify with them what's their risk, how they can manage it, and how to better manage it. There is another thing also, is that usually we don't always have the opportunity. As much as possible, we try to be involved. We don't always have the opportunity to be involved in these decisions, and sometimes we just have to follow what has been told to us. There is also something very important in confidentiality and ownership of the audit reports, where we cannot do what we want, or we cannot always reveal which factories we have audited. So that's an issue to tackle. If we talk about SMETA, the reports are more, for example, what we recommend is, if our clients decide to recognize it, the reports of SMETA belongs to suppliers. So in this case, they have the possibility to get this information from the suppliers, and we can help on that.
I just wonder if in the industry, have you noticed, is there like a benchmark turnover figure from when companies ask you to audit a certain factory?
You mean according to which criteria we decide to the factories are getting audited or not, right?
Yeah, on a financial.
We see different trends, not always on the financial. Is depending really on the programs. We have clients who audit like 100% of their suppliers, and then everybody goes through. The criteria which are used often are Also, sometimes the importance, the strategic supplier, so kind of classification in terms of how strategic the supplier is, and the turnover in this company. The criteria are not always displayed to us on which one they select. What is sure is that what we advise also, and what is more often used, is if we want to have good results, it needs to be in a long-term partnership, and that's the only way to get interesting results and improvements, is to have strategic suppliers and to avoid practices of switching suppliers or just working with one or two orders in each supplier. Otherwise, that's hard to have a long-term projects and buy-in of the suppliers.
Yeah, I would like to share for what we observed in our supply chain. Actually, it seems that we totally understand that is child labor risk in supply chain, it is no doubt. But for what we observed more is in our current supply chain, especially in China or Vietnam, most of the factories, they are facing the problem of labor shortage. So they are really lacking of the skillful workers. So that's why they really would like to retain more workers, especially the young workers. You can see the new generations, they get more educations. They may not want to working in factory anymore. So that will be kind of the challenges is in case there are some juvenile workers. So the factory would like to retain them, but they may have some challenges how to manage these young workers, especially the new generations. They may have different psychological needs or the demand to compare with the other older generations. So that is the challenges that our factory face a lot. So we would like to hear, are there any suggestions or any program that the factory can engage for this? Yeah.
So I guess it's okay if I if I answer. I can start. You can add on. So obviously, I didn't talk about everything that we're doing, but this is a big part, and we totally agree. We see this as a big issue because those factors who hire young workers, whether they're 16, 17, or 18, 19, have a hard time to retain them. Retention is an issue, particularly in China anyways, and we can see it's always the turnover, the employee turnover is always the highest amongst the youngest bracket of workers in that factory. And I would say in average, most Chinese factories have a turnover under the 21 years old, their turnover is up to 35 to 50% per month. So we just see that. So they manage to keep some of the older workers for a very long time, 5, 6, 7 years. But the younger workers who join, they stay for very short periods of time, 3, 4 months. And we've also seen that from a youth development perspective, it's not helpful for most of the workers. We looked at some of the biographies that we encounter and see that those young people who change all the time, they don't advance their career. And those young people who manage to stay somewhere, manage to get somewhere, even within a factory setting, that's potentially becoming more specialized or actually, becoming supervisor, etc. So what we're working on with factories is really the ways in increasing retention and really focusing, because we see a lot of the breakdown is there's sometimes a limited social skill set for those young workers, again often coming out of situations where they didn't have opportunities to learn certain ways of communicating. They don't know how to tackle issues. If they have a conflict with a supervisor, it seems the most logical thing for them just to walk away, whereas there might be possibilities in the factory to actually tackle that. They probably could go to the HR department and say, I really don't get along with him, could you put me in a different line? But they don't know about those things. So really strengthening the way factories manage the young workers within their factories can make a big change. We've had a factory last year, was over 2 years, a really big factory, 7,000 to 10,000 workers, that decided to train every single supervisor on management of young workers, and they managed to considerably increase their retention of young workers. So supervisors learned how to deal with conflicts, how to give feedback, to be more sensitive. It's often also about creating empathy for the young workers, to understand where they're coming from, to understand that they feel that they are the losers in today's China. They probably thought they go to cities for nice and fancy jobs. or working in Starbucks. They ended up not working in Starbucks, but in this factory. So there's a lot of frustration. And there's just by investing in your supervisor to understand that situation, we really could see that there is a difference. But there needs to be some investment of factories to deal with them. And then I think they can actually overcome this. And there's obviously a trend to automation, etc., but it's also linked to offering skill training and really offering a path for the young workers and say, well, you might start now here, but that's where you can get to. If you stick to it, after 2-3 years, that position could be you, and there's a real future. We actually have on our WeChat platform a series that is I Made It, and that creates positive stories about young workers starting out as frontline workers in factories, and in some way or another, it's not Hollywood stories, they don't become billionaires, but they make their lives. They find a good twist, like a good turn to create their lives and then to have happy, decent lives after that. So we're really trying to enforce that.
When I look at a quality control sort of inspection report, those are divided between major defects and minor defects. And because I know the product, I can have an intelligent discussion with everybody about whether this is in fact a major issue or a minor issue. When I look at an ethical audit, which is 50 pages, 100 pages, and if we take things like child labor and slave labor sort of off the table for a moment, how do I prioritize everything else? Is there a general approach to which things are bigger issues or things to focus on first as opposed to other ones? Because I have to have these conversations with my suppliers and with my customers. We have to, these don't happen in a vacuum. We need a practical approach to being able to use the supply chain we have. We can't just turn it off. So is there sort of a general way of looking at all of the criteria and discussing a bridge or a ramp up to how we prioritize what gets changed and when?
Yeah, actually, depending on the audit program, there are different ways, but what we recommend, and the most common way to do it, is to use a similar wording, for example, critical, major, minor, or what is zero tolerance, for example, is some brands, there was some reference about what is classified as zero tolerance, in order to define criteria within the audit program about the severity level, indeed, and about what would be zero tolerance, what would need to be prioritized, and how to follow up on that. That's very commonly actually what we do in the audit programs, is that depending on the findings, we actually put a severity level in front of each findings, which can be defined together according to different risk, different priorities for different people, but we come with our recommendation. And in front of that, what we say is to lead the improvement, so what corrective actions need to be taken, and what's the time frame, and what needs to be done. You may have more or less time, you may also need to be realistic that it's not going to be 100% perfect factories, that does not exist in 1 month, so you need to prioritize. So we always actually do this work when we do our audits, or when we work with our clients, for example, to prioritize the work and to define the guidelines and the guidance on what is the priority. And that's how actually we come up in the end with this traffic light system, which is based on what number of non-compliance, but also what type of non-compliance we find. And that's how we define the red, amber, and green results, for example. We can maybe, if you want to go more in details, I can maybe discuss after the conference.